Good afternoon, and welcome to episode number 3 of Apropos, the latest in geopolitics and the chaos in DC and its impact on financial markets. I'm Patrick Nessenthaler, founder and CEO of Ness & Associates, and I'm joined by my co-host from CFA Society New York, Robert Rowan.
Hello, everyone. I am so pleased that CFA Society New York's podcast Compound Insights is co-hosting this with Patrick, who, as many of the members who are listening will probably recognize Patrick. He's been a regular contributor to CFA New York's content through the Alternative Investing Group. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be doing this with y'all.
Thanks, Rob. In this episode, we will unpack some of the topics that are apropos to the geopolitical concerns that are impacting the world today. Obviously, most notably the war in Israel. To use the metaphor, a frog in boiling water, I feel like much of the geopolitical issues are elevating the world to a significant boiling point, if we aren't boiling already. Multiple conflicts have taken place involving Israel and its Arab neighbors. However, this situation feels unprecedented, as well as on trend with some of the other conflicts around the world, most notably the Ukraine-Russia war, which is the largest European military conflict since World War II. Meanwhile, the most effective democracy ever created remains incapable of executing on any legislative action, as the House of Representatives is still without a House Speaker as of this date of recording on October 16th, 2023. As we close out the 2023 calendar year and begin an election year in 2024, the leading candidates from each party are as polarizing as ever and perhaps epitomize the current state of our society, without direction, without leadership. So what does this all mean for the future of our financial markets? A lot to unpack to answer this question. Let's get right into it. And I want to start off providing a brief bio of our esteemed guest, Mr. Frank Kelly. Mr. Kelly is the founding and managing partner of Fulcrum Macro Advisors, LLC, a political risk advisory firm based in Washington, D.C. He is a seasoned professional with an extensive background in both Wall Street and senior government positions. He began his career as a writer in the White House during the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, later moving to the Justice Department and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He subsequently joined Merrill Lynch Investment Banking, where he held various significant roles, including Chief of Staff and Global Head of Marketing. He then returned to Washington, D.C. to establish Charles Schwab & Co.'s first global government and regulatory affairs operation. In 2003, Frank joined Deutsche Bank, where he served as the bank's first head of government affairs and global coordinator for government and public affairs. He also played a pivotal role in mergers and acquisitions, advising on national and economic security-related deals. Currently, Frank serves as the chief geopolitical strategist for DWS, a prominent asset management firm. Additionally, he works as a senior advisor for the Scowcroft Group, an international business advisory firm, and teaches at the Catholic University School of Business. Frank is also a senior associate at the Center for International and Strategic Studies, focusing on Latin America politics, economics, and trade. Frank is actively involved in various organizations, including the Jerome Lejeune Foundation of America, the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the American Council on Germany, and the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. Wow. Thanks for joining us, Frank. I know you're a busy guy, and I know your time's very important, so we greatly appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks for listing all those organizations that I pay dues to.
Indeed. All right, Frank. So we're going to kick this off, and obviously the first thing we need to kind of discuss is the war in Israel. And conflict in this part of the world is nothing new. Israel has fought multiple wars against Arab countries and Palestinian groups since the Jewish state was founded in 1948. However, as I stated in my intro, this war feels a bit different. China gave Russia the green light to invade Ukraine. Similarly, Iran not only gave Hamas the green light, there's also plenty of speculation that they helped plan it. My question to you, or two questions, is this conflict on trend with what we're seeing from some of the BRICS countries as it relates to their conquest of becoming a global superpower? And are we starting to see a formulation of another axis of evil, which is what George Bush Jr. had coined several years ago?
A lot to dive into there. First, I would say I think we do have sort of that axis of evil, some variation of it, right? With Russia and Iran. You look at Iran with the military support they're providing Russia. They're almost well into building a new facility, manufacturing facility in Russia to manufacture the drones that the Iranians have really perfected, very advanced, that they've been selling in there. You've got North Korea Kim Jong-un meeting with Putin a month ago. It's hard to remember. Boy, we have to go back to look at all of our maps these days, right? That there's that sliver of Russia on the border of North Korea, where the North Koreans are selling munitions to Russia. It's something the North Koreans actually are quite good at, the basic stuff, the bullets, the artillery shells, not so much advanced stuff. And in return, it appears the Russians are going to be giving some advanced technology to North Korea. You've got Iran in the middle of all of this. There's some other actors out there who aren't so good participating in all of this. So, yes, you do sort of see this, and the BRICS tie-in is very interesting. I personally don't think the BRICS are going to be a threat economically, or the discussions of them coming up with a common currency. I think that's more of an academic discussion at this point. And you look at the latest membership entrance to the BRICS. Yeah, Saudi Arabia has been invited. They haven't formally accepted, it's my understanding. But you've got, Ethiopia, you've got Argentina. Really? I mean, not anything but economic powerhouses. And if anything, just looking at the economy of Argentina, for example, the blue dollar situation down there, where it's just, you can't even calculate. I had a friend who was down there for business and went out to dinner with a friend. The friend showed up with a big backpack. He said, "What's that?" He said, "This is all of my Argentinian currency to pay for dinner." He says, I've got $30. I can cover US dollars. And it did, right?
Right.
So it's something they're aspiring to, but that's not imminent at all, medium term and probably even longer term. But there is an effort, right, to destabilize the dollar, to overcome the Western dominance for a number of reasons, right? So they're not dependent on the U.S. For the Russians and the Chinese, it breaks through tariffs and sanctions if they could do this. But again, I don't see that imminently. I do think when you get to the Middle East, we are at a new point. What Hamas did was just so horrific. And I even trying to look for some sort of, was there a method to the madness here? Were they crazy like a fox?
Right.
I think the only thing they're going to get out of this is at some point, maybe this unifies or rekindles the Islamic world's anger towards Israel. But look at so much progress has been made there. The Abraham Accords, the relationship between Israel and so many of these countries where they were hostile. And we were getting closer. We weren't as close as it's been reported, seeing Israel with Saudi Arabia formally. But what is not formal and the informal relationship between Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, I should say, the capital, and Riyadh is much more formidable in terms of common interests in Iran being an enemy. So there's many different levels of coloration here, right? So I think the big question will be, once Israel goes into Gaza, what do they do? Do they really want to reoccupy it? Which would be, I would predict, a nightmare for them, just because who is the hostile, right? This is the big problem going in. You say you're going to eliminate Hamas. Yeah, okay, totally understandable and 100% supportive. But what is Hamas? It can be a 12-year-old boy. It can be a 13-year-old girl, right? They don't wear uniforms. This is going to be extremely hard to police that. And so I'm very curious as to how Israel progresses and what they're going to do. But back to my earlier point of sort of this axis of evil, but it's also an axis of disorganization and not great unity either. No Arab country stepping up saying we want to take Palestinian refugees. Even look among the Palestinians themselves, the West Bank. Yes, there's been some violence, some rioting, but you're not seeing that blow up like Gaza. And that's because you have the Fatah faction of the Palestinians at the throat of Hamas all this time, and vice versa. So we are in a new phase. It's very unpredictable. And I think for the markets, you can't stay sanguine about any of this, because what does this mean for not just oil, but for shipping? The Suez Canal's not that far away. A lot to be played out here, and very unpredictable.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll talk about, I guess, that first derivative of what we think in terms of financial markets, which is what oil and the short and long-term effects of that. But as it relates to the prior question, I also want to discuss kind of this new era of modern warfare in terms of where cyberspace has become kind of the new battleground in order to weaken enemies, most notably by targeting crucial infrastructure such as power and communication systems. And this is just my hypothesis, but I feel like we are also seeing outright economic manipulations in which OPEC Plus cuts global oil production, kind of immediately following hawkish commentary from Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, which could exacerbate the battle against inflation, as well as spark future interest rate increases here in the States. I guess with all that said, is America ready for this kind of new warfare? Or are we behind the curve?
My personal view is I think we're behind the curve. And part of this is a generational thing, right? I mean, the idea that the Vietnam War, the Korean War, World War II, the economics mattered. There's been some great stuff written about that. You know, Adam Tooze has written great economic studies of why the Nazis collapsed. Fantastic book he wrote, which sheds different light. But this is the markets are so much more integrated, and there's so much more retail. Mm-hmm. And because of technology, they move so much faster. You know, you can get oil someplace else. You can get commodities someplace else, and you move quickly, and you can negotiate so much. It doesn't take weeks or months to communicate about these things. And so the market, I think this is one of the reasons the market has not figuratively blown up in terms of oil or other commodities. The food security scare that we have faced and are going to face, there are ways of dealing with this. But it's hard, and this is requiring the markets. And I think one of the reasons we're even discussing this today, the markets now suddenly have to become geopolitical experts, right? It was one thing to be experts at numbers and calculating and making estimates, and then even the psychology of the markets. Now you've got to be the geopolitical protagonist, understanding all of this. Where are we going? Mm-hmm. And how do I not get creamed on this? And quite frankly, it's becoming the free markets a weapon of democracy and freedom.
Okay, well, I mean, this is perhaps a place for me to step in here, because I think that a lot of CFA New York members have become concerned about the energy markets writ large. The energy markets are always well known to be a counterparty to everything from manufacturing to travel and entertainment. And now, after what happened last year with pricing of natural gas, it's also become a public policy issue for the OECD nations writ large, which most of them are getting ready to go into wintertime. So there's a lot going on here. Before you answer that, Frank, I just want to second your endorsement of Adam Tooze. His writing is excellent. He also has a perfectly good podcast called Ones and Twos, TOZ, for anybody who wants to listen to it. So, but please have at it. What do you think this means for energy markets, particularly as they become such a local and regional public policy issue now?
We would see what Russia has let me just say this. Let's step back and say, look what has happened because of the Ukrainian war, right? The invasion and assault on Ukraine. You've got Europe now has cut itself off from oil and natural gas. There was the huge concern that just literally a year ago, remember the warnings in Germany that government officials were beginning to say that everybody's going to have to start taking cold showers, and we're going to turn the heat down. And well, fortunately, they got by, and they did even better. But then look to see where Germany and other European EU countries then massively, in an almost wartime capacity, building LNG facilities, seemingly overnight when you look back at it, in terms of being able to importing it from the U.S. and elsewhere. The markets moved, to my earlier point. They moved so fast that they could, with good CFAs and coupled with good geopolitical outlook, you put them together, all of a sudden there's an investment opportunity coming out of this, right? And to my point, where the free markets are becoming a weapon of freedom and democracy. So I am concerned. I am concerned about where we're going with all of this and how this plays out. And I think this is something that Putin very much is attempting to manipulate, right? And you think about some of the things that he has done with all of this. I point to the fact that talk about dislocation or just sort of bizarre anomalies to the markets, the oil markets. India is the largest exporter of petroleum products to the EU. Wait, what? I didn't know there was even a single oil derrick or gas drilling facility in India. Well, it's all because the Russians selling it to them in these incredibly steep discounts. That just won't be able to persist, of course, but it is what it is. And the Europeans know that it's Russian oil, but it's also because they put a cap on Russian oil, which the Russians are breaking through here and there. And there's been new sanctions applied, right? They're tightening that up. But again, the markets have figured this out. And India now plays that market role in terms of selling to Europe. You have even today, and this is, we were talking even before we started, it's sort of how things have changing so fast. You've got news now that the U.S. has negotiated with Venezuela today that they're going to start loosening restrictions on oil exports if Venezuelans are willing to make compromises on elections, right? And that the dictatorship down there of Maduro is willing to take that risk because they need it. That's huge.
Yeah. The markets went a little crazy today over that. But could we just back up for 1 second? Let me ask you a quick follow-up question. You talked about India's exporting of energy and other types of hard materials to the EU. Now, there's also been a bit of a kerfluffle with India in the last couple of weeks when it seems clear-ish at this point that as Indian forces were in Canada and executed a Canadian citizen.
Yes.
And that caused the Five Eyes countries to line up pretty fast. How do you think that is going to roll out? The situation there is a lot different because the Canadian government pretty much said, hey, everybody, that was on our sovereign land, and didn't have a military reaction to it. So how do you see that breaking?
My guess at this point, just a guess, is it's one of those things that gets ironed out over time. You've seen the reduction in Canadian embassy staff. I think 30 of them had to leave India, and something similar, certainly from the Canadians. But I don't think it's the kind of thing that will destroy a relationship. And while there's been muted criticism from other Western countries, the United States among them, I think it's one of those things that ultimately gets ironed out in some form or fashion. And it goes to, there could be a constructive aspect of this, because without drilling too deep into it, I love this, not nerding out on everybody here, is, for somebody like Prime Minister Modi and the ruling party there, in many ways, they're more worried about external Indian expat threats, if you will, as political opponents than even internally. Well, if this can be worked out, that all of a sudden India now, Prime Minister Modi in New Delhi now begins to understand that US, Canada, the EU, you shouldn't have done that. That was bad. It was stupid. But we're also your ally, and you don't have to worry about these things. We're not going to allow a coup to be fomented, in Ottawa and brought over to India, right? That's not where things are anymore.
So obviously we went kind of broad and talked a lot about geopolitical issues and things that are outside states. But I kind of want to bring it back to the U.S. And, this is going to be another loaded question for you, which I wouldn't call it a question. I'm just curious what your reaction is, because I don't think there's a legitimate answer for it, but I kind of want to build up to it. So for the first time in our country's history, the House of Representatives voted to remove the House Speaker. However, the clock is ticking on a stopgap funding bill that will keep the U.S. government open until mid-November. However, business in the House cannot continue until someone is elected to the role as Speaker of the House. Meanwhile, our country is truly entering a quote-unquote death spiral as it relates to our U.S. debt. New numbers from the government's fiscal platform show that the country's debt surged from $32.9 trillion on September 14th to $33.5 trillion on October 5th, which is a $524 billion increase in just a couple of weeks. The U.S. government is piling on debt onto its balance sheet, adding more than $500 billion in just 3 weeks. This debt load is unsustainable. If you can answer this, I'm curious what your reaction is. What is the critical path for D.C. in order to get our country operating like a legitimate sovereign entity?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a speaker. We're going to have a vote tomorrow, Tuesday, on Jim Jordan, who seems to be, even over the weekend, people thought there was no way he was going to win, but now there's a number of people who have flipped. I think the way that we get to where we need to go is people need to start having this discussion. There are not enough CFAs in Washington, D.C. Let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Patrick, you just talk about the deficit ballooning. That's even an understatement. I was talking with somebody, very senior congressional staffer, even over the weekend, and I was talking about how the deficit is just blowing up because of rates. And sort of looking at me like, what are you talking about? We haven't spent anything. We haven't done anything. It's like, hey, buddy, the rates went up. The interest rates went up. So we are paying more. And that's just one example. I've had conversations with multiple people on the Hill and other policy focused people in DC. They didn't understand this. They're not getting it. Right?
Yeah.
And it is becoming, and unfortunately, you go into an election year, nobody wants to start talking about cutting programs.
Right.
Except very conservative Republicans, and their district, great, but whatever. You're not going to get there. It's become the additional third rail in some ways in Washington. You can't talk about Social Security reform. You can't talk about Medicaid reform. And nobody's having a substantive, goal-oriented deficit reduction discussion. And now we're about ready to spend a lot of money, which we have to do and need to do and should do for Israel. We're still more money for Ukraine. We're looking at Social Security going bankrupt by 2032, 33, Medicaid Part D in 34, Highway Trust Fund in 26. I mean, these discussions aren't happening. If I'm hopeful in this sense. You want to get through the next year and get through the elections, because then in that first year, 2025, you can have these discussions on deficit reduction. But I think something else is going to happen more imminently. And that is, Patrick and Rob, I don't think we're going to get the appropriations bills done this year. Right? We have a continuing resolution that expires November 17th. Mm-hmm. Then you're going to have to vote on another continuing resolution to get us through the end of the year, why they get the appropriations done, all 12 bills. They're not going to get them done. They're not going to get the continuing resolution. So I think there's a very high chance we have a government shutdown on the 17th, which will probably go on through the rest of the year, and none of the appropriations bills done. And in fairness here, I'm not partisan at all. And what I'm doing, if I'm partisan, it's for my clients and, market analysis. Yep. The Senate hasn't gotten any of the appropriations bills done. And there's such a variance in what we're looking at, where you've got this conservative, rebellious group among the Republicans. And we're not even talking about this. They're looking for a 10% cut, up to a 10% cut in appropriations.
Wow.
Right. So we did the debt ceiling agreement that we wouldn't spend over a certain amount. Everybody in the Senate, including most of the Republicans, are like, great, we'll fill the glass up and it won't go over that amount. Whereas these Republicans in the House are saying that's the cap, but we want 10% less. So where are you going to get that? And how are you going to get that done between now, mid-October, and December 31st? And if you don't get it done, to remind everybody, you don't get it done by December 31st, boys and girls, pens down, test is over, 1% cut comes into effect. If you're one of these rebel Republicans, hey, if I can't get 10%, I'll take 1% as a consolation prize. Because I will be able to claim that by hook or crook, I'm beginning to impose fiscal discipline. But that's no way to govern either.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is where this comes into focus for a lot of CFA New York members and other CFA Society members around the world is on infrastructure funding. So if the Fed, the CBOE has been talking about this since I had more hair and more of it was brown, with the Federal Highway Trust Fund. Some of this deficit stuff has been going on since my son was born. He's in high school now, so this is not news. What is becoming a greater risk in many CFA New York members' minds, which Frank, I'd be very interested in what you think, is, does this push the states and the locals into more infrastructure funding, greater infrastructure funding role at a time when their borrowing costs are going to be higher? And some of them don't really have the ability to put this directly on their budget when there is no really solid PPP legislation basically anywhere. So is this putting the states and the locals into a bigger problem as they have to comply with not only to pay for the sort of the debt, as it's called, in infrastructure funding, but also climate change issues?
Oh, absolutely. But the states are already moving there, and they've been moving there for several years as well. There's a complete breakdown, if you will, in the relationship between the federal and state level. Most what is blaring on the news every day, just look at the immigration issue, right? This is Texas exporting illegals here. Where's the federal government in this? This is a border issue. What are we doing? Now, it's also a congressional issue. They have to come up with immigration reform. That is just a mess. And to think back, you talk about having hair. I actually had hair. And it was the Reagan administration did immigration reform, right? Oh, for Pete's sake. How long ago was that, right? So I think states across the board are now becoming more and more determined that they're going to decide what happens in their state and try and break off from the federal government wherever they can. But then you've got this, when is Jay Powell going to start lowering rates so that we can start doing more on infrastructure? And I would add to that, you talk about climate related issues and everything else. Yeah, we just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're all going to have electric cars. Yeah, well, states control the electrical grids, not the feds. And right. I hate to say it, they're a mess. So they're going to have to do something. Well, maybe they're not.
Right. And this kind of brings us back to energy policy again, because the impact of EV cars depends largely on how your local authority actually makes the electricity. And that could change when you change consumption, that can change pricing dramatically quickly.
Dramatically. And look, there's one very large financial institution that I talk to regularly that has done a lot of research on this. Their view is, okay, if you're going to scale up the electric vehicles and you look at the electrical grid, where it stands now, there's a lot of states. The example that was given to me, you got a neighborhood of 100 homes. Now, I don't know if this is the science to this. I'm just relaying this story. You got 100 homes. You hit 40 or 50 of those homes now having electric vehicles. You're going to have brownouts 3 days a week and a couple blackouts a month. Nobody's going to go for that.
Nobody's discussing it either.
No,
yeah, I was going to say, if they have a choice. Yeah.
Well, I will bring our spirits up and talk about being facetious, but talk about our election that's next year. And, I want to talk a little bit about Trump, which is, our favorite candidate. But, I didn't watch 60 Minutes last night, but every time I listen to Bloomberg kind of, getting ready for the day, and every time I hear Joe Biden do a soundbite, he sounds tired. He sounds like I can't do this anymore. And unfortunately, on the other side of the coin, we have Trump. So I'm going to kind of set up the question that I'm very curious what your reaction is, both from just a personal standpoint and where, what you perceive from a political standpoint as well. But so again, Donald Trump might be the most perplexing U.S. candidate in American history. This is according to an article from the Washington Post back in mid-August. Former President Donald Trump faces a total of 91 charges across 4 criminal cases. They include 44 federal charges and 47 state charges. All of them are felonies. However, he leads the GOP in the polls by a large margin and continues to raise money for the presidential run. In just the third quarter of 2023, he raised $45.5 million, despite all these criminal charges. I guess the only question I have here is just, can you describe to me who the average Trump voter is and why he keeps getting this type of support?
So this is the part of the podcast where I'm really hoping all my neighbors plug in their electric vehicles.
The brownout?
It's like a brown.
No, complete blackout.
Blackout.
I think I don't really know, but I have some theories. And I think this goes back in a weird way almost to 2008, the financial crisis, in which we saw the rise of the Tea Party. And what was interesting about the Tea Party, I remember the New York Times did a very big, in-depth study back then as to who the Tea Party was. And they weren't political. There were as many Democrats as Republicans. They were people who were angry that Washington had let this happen. And that being people being able to get a mortgage for nothing. And, everybody's lives were upended. And you got to go back, and it's worth watching. What was the great movie talked about the mortgage?
Oh, The Big Short? The
Big Short. It's worth going back. I actually make my students watch that because they have no concept of entire neighborhoods empty. Everybody, remember people dropping their keys and leaving? And I tell them this and they're like, watch the movie. This was real, right? Where it was 25, 30%, or maybe even higher of Las Vegas was vacant or foreclosed. What? So there was an anger element there towards Washington. And then I think it then morphed into the hard progressive left and the hard conservative right. Right. And it was the government should have done better and we need better, bigger government. And the other side saying it's a swamp. It's horrible. And my whole life has been changed. And my parents' life has been changed. The early retirement, they're working, they're an Uber driver and they're 70. I got in an Uber the other day in New York, and it was a 75-year-old guy. He needed the money. And, I thought, wow, that's something. So I think that was the roots of it. And then just when we were hitting a turning point, COVID hits. And that then was added jet fuel to the fire, where people became even more angry, suspicious, and going their stuff, right? So it reinforced it. I think that we may actually be beginning to make the turn back again. A lot of it will depend on how the economy does. And this is why Jay Powell and his soft landing, please no recession, and how he's managing this is so critical. And I have a feeling he may actually pull this out and be a great, great American hero, which will be important, I think, politically in ways we don't understand. A lot of it will depend on when rates start coming down and how angry people will be this time next year. Do they see hope? Right? That's important. So I think a lot of that fed into Trump. There's an anger issue here,
right?
Of nothing works. And I've talked to enough Trump supporters, which sort of goes to the January 6th event, the horror of that, where people just think the whole thing needs to be burned down and start over again, literally. Now, we're not going to do that. Please God, we don't do that, because that's civil war as well. But I also think that we need to brace for something very unexpected to happen on both fronts, Republican and Democrat. These legal charges are extremely serious. Some of them, maybe not, right? I mean, the New York lawsuit that was the first one that came up over Stormy Daniels, and, where's that going? We don't hear about that anymore. And a lot of people have discounted that as likely not happening. The top secret document case, we're not talking about that either. But you talk to a lot of Republicans and Democrats, even Trump supporters, that's as serious as it gets. And that could be a very quick case and he could be convicted. And that's not a probation thing, right? And it's the most sensitive top secret information. And it was very different from what Mike Pence had or Joe Biden had. This wasn't actionable, ongoing intelligence operations. That's serious. Now, he'll appeal it and probably won't be settled by the election, but I think the American public may take a different look. The January 6th case, I don't know where that's going, but I think there's some very big shoes to drop on that. So let's see what happens. The Georgia case brought by the local prosecutor, she was a little late to the game, to be honest. I don't think that case gets tried until after the election. That being said, I also think that the polls are off. I don't know how. I just have gut sense. And I'll share with you, and sorry, I don't want to monopolize this, but I've been spending a lot of time in Iowa on various client things and speaking to a lot of bankers, business people. It's a very weird, I can't justify it. I recently spoke to a large group of local Iowa bankers, and I spent a lot of time with them before and afterwards. I probably spoke to more than 50 of them in depth, and I kind of used it as a very unofficial, unscientific focus group. Mm-hmm. I couldn't find one of them who was voting for Trump. And now this isn't big banks. These are local guys. And then I drilled in, what about your farm clients and your small businesses? Same thing. All very respectful, very grateful for what he had done as president for them. Laundry list. But they all want something different. And I would point to a poll last week that Fox came out with. Yeah, Trump was way ahead, but for the Republicans. But he would lose to Biden. DeSantis would win by 1 or 2 points, and Nikki Haley would win by 4 or 5 points. Those things are going to change, are working in people's minds. My point being, we could see a big flip here, and don't be surprised if we do in the next 3 to 4 months before we get to the Iowa caucuses, and Trump deflating suddenly. Let's watch for that. I think when Youngkin gets into the race in November, it's a very high, and his name recognition in Iowa was shocking to me, sky high. They like Nikki Haley. I'm not endorsing anybody. I'm not being partisan here, but I'm seeing these things. So that could happen. And the other big issues you've raised is Biden. The 60 Minutes interview yesterday, where the White House staff was warning 60 Minutes, and they're talking, hey, just heads up, he's really tired because he's been working so hard in Israel, which I'm sure he has. But that makes him stutter more, and he may not be as lucid. I've never seen a president have come in with those disclaimers before any interview. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of Democrats really worried he's not going to make it. So who steps up? So I think there's, again, from a market perspective, brace for either Trump or Biden not being the nominees. And it coming at us very quickly, which will be will have some sort of market impact.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to dig into your conversations with bankers there, your role at a large bank also, and a little bit about that anger that you were talking about before. In the last 15 years or so, what has happened during times of anger, and also because of the issues at Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate Banking, Signature, et cetera, all the S's, is more bank regulation. This is as a person who worked for a bond rating agency during that time you talked about, the concept of more bank regulation is sort of astounding, but especially the GSIBs. But what do you reckon, whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House, what do you think the likelihood of bank regulation is over the next couple of months, say years? And what do you think it's going to look like? Handcuffs on commercial lending? What do you think it is?
I spent a lot of time on this, certainly did this in my years at Deutsche Bank, elsewhere. So a couple of things. Let's go back to the appropriations failure. There's a 1% cut. That is a 1% cut to all the financial regulators.
Right.
So let me get this straight. You guys are asking for more money for regulation, right? Gary Gensler at the SEC, right? Not only are you need more budget because you have very aggressive regulatory agendas. So if you're not only you're not going to get that, but you're going to get cut, are you still going to proceed with these regulatory agendas, which therefore you will not have the wherewithal, arguably, to enforce?
Right.
Then we're going to get into all sorts of litigation. We saw this with the investment advice issue that came out from the Department of Labor at the end of the Obama administration.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
Congress defunded it. And so that's a whole can of worms. And to the bank regulation issue, I think we still need to unpack what the heck happened at SVB Bank. Mm-hmm. Right. How did a bank of that size go for 9 months without, a chief risk officer? what was the role of the regulators? Now, Congress hasn't drilled. They kind of held preliminary discussions and then they moved on because I think it scared the heck out of them. They didn't want another 2008, and they didn't want to for just too much PTSD, I think, for a lot of them. But you see the big bank regulatory issue at the moment is the Fed and the FDIC moving forward with new capital requests. I point out that Jay Powell was not supportive. He voted in favor of it, but it's very clear that he didn't support it. You've got Congress not happy with it on the House side. And interestingly enough, it's the acting Speaker of the House, Patrick McHenry, who is a very smart guy on markets and banking, chair of the House Financial Services Committee. That's his day job. And he's pushing back on this. I also would point to the fact that Michael Barr, the vice chair for supervision at the Fed, is giving an awful lot of speeches about this. In fact, he's giving one this week on stress testing, but a bit of capital requirements. That says to me almost you're being a little defensive about this. You're clearly going out and making a sales pitch on this and trying to articulate as best you can why we need to do it. But I think the pushback is going to be substantial. Where does that come out? Does it get scaled back, shaved back? I suspect that might be the case. And where does bank regulation go going forward? If it's a Republican, Gary Gensler's out, new chairs at the FDIC, OCC, we're not going to see as much. The Democrat wins, yes. Then I think you'll still sort of see this, but this gets back to the elections again. And one thing we haven't drilled in, let me take 10 seconds on this. It's the Senate that has to confirm all of these regulators. There are 33 seats up in 2024. 23 of them are Democrat, and 5 of them are red states. And 3 of them are states that Trump won in 2016 and 2020, right? Montana and Ohio. So I think there's a pretty good prospect we have a Republican Senate in 2025 when they're seated. Democrat Joe Biden gets reelected, and he needs to put in most of these people will cycle out, and you're going to need new people. There's going to be a lot of fighting over where the future of regulation is, right? Can you get them confirmed? Are they too radical? Are they too? So I think this is a wide open field here, which isn't helpful to the average person sitting in a bank, financial institution doing risk or compliance or anything else.
Great. Thanks. Excellent.
Oh, one other thing, court cases dealing with financial regulation. Supreme Court is hearing this session 2 major cases that, without getting too into the weeds on this, could really clip the wings of financial regulators going forward. It will allow the courts to step in much more quickly, much more firmly to scale back whatever they put out. So you better have everything buttoned down if you're going to push forward on those regulations, because it's going to end up in court one way or the other.
Well, Frank, we've covered a lot during this pod, but obviously the show is apropos. So what else is apropos to geopolitics and the issues in DC that we did not mention in this discussion?
I think we're actually entering a cooling off period between China and the United States. And it's one of these things, I think because of COVID, maybe we're so event driven. We look for that event. But you can't see or feel what's happening beneath this, the constant conversations that are going on between Washington and Beijing, and even Brussels and Beijing, where they're sort of like forging new guardrails, if you will, on trade. You're going to have the vice premier of China in Washington this week. And they're going to talk about trade issues, but they're also ironing out the final details of what appears to be President Xi coming to San Francisco in November. I think it's the 15th for the APEC summit. That's a big deal if he shows up. I mean, he didn't go to the G20. He's blown off other ones. And if he comes to San Francisco, there is a good chance he comes to Washington afterwards. The U.S. Commerce Department is going to put out new regulations this week on semiconductor and other high-tech sales to China. I'm going to bet that it's not as biting as a lot of people think, and that a lot of this was pre-cooked and worked out, if you will, and signaled to China that they're not going to be screaming about it. And now you've also got new work streams that have been developed between Washington and Beijing on sectors on how can we work through these trade issues. For Xi to show up here and feel comfortable enough to show up here is a huge statement. And again, I think we're working through this. And back to what we started with Israel. What role does China play, working with the U.S. and others, to bring calm to Israel, which China's been critical of Israel over all of this, but they want to be a major player. These are the things, these shifts, these tectonic shifts that can be quite subtle, but quite big and quite positive for the markets going forward.
Well, listen, Frank, appreciate the time. I know you're a busy guy, so I appreciate your time taking
thanks so much.
speaking with us.
I'd love to do this again, and we'll all smoke a cigar together as we're doing it.
Perfect. After we do the plunge, right?
Yes.
I don't know if I told Rob about our conversation about the plunge pools, but apparently there's a lot of research behind it too.
Ice bath.
Oh, this is those things. Yeah.
Oh, ice bath. Excuse me.
Yeah.
It's not making my hair grow back, but I feel great.
Well, it's worth it. So, well, thank you both.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye.